abuse of power. I don't think that the executive branch should be used for emergency powers in this kind of circumstance. And he is using political ploys to do what he wants when he wants, and it's wrong.
And the president admitting just moments after declaring a national emergency that he didn't need to do it. This morning, as the president wakes up at his golf resort in Florida, lawsuits are already being filed to block his executive order.
Let's get to CNN White House reporter Sarah Westwood, traveling there with the president in West Palm Beach, Florida. Sarah, good morning.
Good morning, Victor and Kaylee. And yeah, President Trump directly tying that emergency declaration to the failure of Congress to fund his border wall. And that's a connection that could undermine his administration's expected argument in court, which is that this declaration was not an attempt to circumvent Congress when it refused to appropriate what Trump thought he needed for the border wall. Now, with this declaration, the Trump administration will try to unlock an additional $6 billion in federal funds that'll come from a few different sources. It'll come from Treasury Department forfeiture funds, from the Pentagon's drug interdiction program, and also from military construction funds. Now, there are a couple of things that Congress can do to try to slow down or stop this from happening, and one of them is to pass a resolution of disapproval. That's something House Democrats have already said they plan to pursue. Another is investigate. House Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler, he's a Democrat. He's already saying he plans to hold hearings to look into the process that led up to this declaration. And the Trump administration could also face some other challenges in court. For example, special interest groups. They can challenge the constitutionality of this declaration. And also landowners who hold private property along the border. They are expected to bring cases in court to try to stop the government from using eminent domain to seize their land when they need to build the border wall in certain parts along the southern border. So the Trump administration facing a number of roadblocks as they try to get that $6 billion. The only money right now that they are guaranteed to get their hands on, Victor and Kaylee, is that $1.4 billion in the bipartisan spending package that Trump signed yesterday.
All right, Sarah Westwood for us there in West Palm Beach. Thank you.
And joining me now, CNN political analyst and Washington Post congressional reporter Rachel Bade. Good morning, Rachel.
Good morning.
You wrote an article in the Washington Post titled "A Recipe for Disaster. Trump's border emergency drags the GOP into a risky fight ahead of 2020." Can you paint that picture for me, the different scenarios that Republican lawmakers find themselves in at this moment?
Yeah, so privately, Republicans are grumbling because they feel like the president has sort of unwittingly pulled them into his own 2020 reelection campaign in a way that they didn't really want to go. I mean, the president feels personally that declaring a national emergency and building his border wall is going to really be welcomed by the base and is going to help his own reelection effort in 2020. But there are a lot of Republicans who are very divided on this, and they face this sort of double-edged sword as they figure out how are they going to vote on this issue when Democrats force them to do so in a few weeks. Now, if they support the president, they're going to be going against what they purport to be their own principles, which is, you know, the Constitution, separation of powers, that Congress has the power of the purse. And a lot of them feel like they don't want to support this privately. But if they oppose it and they go against the president, they're going to anger his base, and they could be seen as going against the border wall, which is very popular with Republicans. So they're in this really difficult position, and a lot of them, frankly, don't know what to do.
Are there Republicans you can point to specifically as those just being in a lot of trouble right now when they think about their own political future and the ramifications of their decision here?
Yes, of course. I mean, if in 2020, Senate Republicans are going to be defending 22 seats to Democrats' only 12 seats up in 2020. So look at these Republicans from purple states, people like Tom Tillis in North Carolina. He has been an ally on the president on a bunch of issues, but on this, he's putting his foot down, and he said, look, a future potential President Bernie Sanders could try to declare an emergency and enact the Green New Deal, which would, you know, totally upend a lot of business regulations and could really, have an effect on the economy. This is not something Republicans want to see happen. And so he's put his foot down and said, I do not support this. But I do think it's telling there are a lot of people who are up in really red states, places like Texas. John Cornyn, who, again, is another Trump ally, who was very critical of this idea. And ever since Trump has announced it, he has really backed off, and he has not said how he's going to vote. And again, this just highlights this predicament predicament that Republicans are in, where they don't particularly agree with the president, but going against him could alienate those Republicans in Texas, and Cornyn's got to watch out for that, too.
Right, and Republicans, even some of the more vocal critics of President Trump, they're not really speaking out about how they would vote should that opportunity arise. Why is that?
You know, the White House right now has been reaching out to a lot of staff on the Hill, Republican staff on the Hill, and also lawmakers, pretty much encouraging them to keep their powder dry. Just wait till you see the final wording of our emergency declaration, and also wait till you see what the Democratic resolution disapproving this whole move by the president actually looks like. I think some Republicans are hoping that Democrats overreach and put something very partisan in this resolution disapproving this move. And that would sort of give them a reason to vote against the Democrats and vote with the president. But yeah, they're in this pickle. And right now, I think until they're actually pressed on that vote in a couple of weeks, I think a lot of them will probably not say their position publicly because they can't win either way.
Yeah, we've seen Mitch McConnell flip back and forth over whether or not declaring a national emergency would be a good idea for the president. He said he supported it in that final hour, but after the declaration yesterday, he didn't say anything. What kind of example do you think that he's setting?
So McConnell is one of those people that advised the president against doing this. The Senate Majority Leader clearly privately does not think this is a good idea, and he thinks that it divides the party and puts them in this awkward position whether they're going to have to decide whether to support the president or repudiate him. And so, you know, a few weeks ago, and even in the days leading up to this declaration, McConnell was telling the president, don't do this, don't do this. And he had thought he convinced the president to his way of thinking. Well, guess what? Trump changed his mind and decided he wants to build his wall, and he's going to do it by any means necessary. So he ignored McConnell's advice. So now McConnell has come out in support of this, but very tepidly so. There's not a lot of passion when he talks about it. It's very clear that the only reason he's doing this is because it was the only way to get the president to sign a funding deal that had come out of Congress that does not include his wall money. It seemed like almost a tit for tat kind of thing. So, you know, McConnell's very reluctantly embracing this.
Okay. Rachel Bade, we really appreciate your time and perspective. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We've got the latest now on that deadly shooting in Aurora, Illinois. At least 5 people are dead, 5 police officers wounded after a man started shooting at a manufacturing business. Authorities say the suspect, who was being let go by the company, was killed in a gun battle with police. CNN correspondent Scott McLean is in Aurora with the latest. Scott, good morning to you. What have you learned?
Hey, Victor. Well, this is an industrial complex, an industrial building, but it's actually located in the middle of a residential area, which made for a very chaotic scene yesterday, as you can imagine. What we know is that yesterday afternoon, police got several 911 calls coming from inside of this building reporting shots fired. And when they got here, they immediately took gunfire from the suspect, 45-year-old Gary Martin. The initial reports were that he was shooting from a window. 2 police officers were shot initially, and then when more officers arrived as backup, 3 more were shot at that point. Then police believe that he retreated deep inside the building, and we're talking about a sprawling complex, some 29,000 square feet. Again, a lot of industrial equipment inside of there. Plenty of places potentially for him to hide. The police chief said that at one point there were 13 different teams of law enforcement who were inside to locate Martin or to help get victims out of there and get them to the hospital. In all, it took an hour and a half for police to locate Gary Martin. When they got to him, he shot at them. They say they returned fire. He was ultimately killed. 5 employees were killed. 1 was injured along with those 5 police officers as well. Now, as you mentioned, Victor, Martin was fired yesterday from his job, a position that he held for 15 years. What is not clear is whether his victims were targeted or whether they were random. It's also not clear whether he started shooting right away or maybe went back to his car or his home to get a gun before he started firing. Here's how the police chief responded when asked about his motive.
I I hate that we have to use the term classic workplace shooting. That pains me to do so. At this time, I don't know. Again, we can only surmise, with a gentleman who's being terminated, that this was something he intended to do. I'm not sure. Right now, we know that he was acting alone, and that's what we're trying to determine right now is, maybe to give us some clues inside, into his mindset, and if he had planned this or if it was premeditated in any way. At this point, we just don't know.
What we do know, though, is that all of this was carried out with just a handgun. Witnesses said that it had a laser sight on it. Police did search his apartment. They will hold a press conference later on this morning where we're hoping to learn more about these victims. We don't know any names right now other than all of them were male. Victor.
All right, still some questions there. Scott McLean, thanks so much.
And still to come here on New Day, lavish spending and secret income are caught up to former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. Special counsel prosecutors say he deserves to spend essentially the rest of his life behind bars.
Also ahead, we speak to a team of nurses who are trapped in Haiti as the political crisis out of greed. His lifestyle of defrauding banks, the IRS, other federal authorities may put him in prison for the rest of his life. Now, Manafort was convicted last year for bank and tax fraud and other financial crimes relating to work he did for Ukrainian politicians. He will be sentenced next month.
Meanwhile, the special counsel's office revealed in a new court filing that prosecutors have evidence of Roger Stone's communication with WikiLeaks relating to the release of those Democratic emails that were hacked. The information came from dozens of search warrants on various accounts used to make the transfer of the stolen documents. They also show the timing and promotion of their release. The full extent of Stone's communication is still yet to be revealed.
We've got Michael Moore, former U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, back with us. Good to have you again.
Glad to be back.
Let's start here with Manafort and what we learned from this filing. Let's put it up on the screen here. A remarkable line out of this filing. Given the breadth of Manafort's criminal activity, the government has not located a comparable case with the unique array of crimes and aggravating factors. Not another case like this one.
I think that's significant, but I think you've got to remember, too, we're talking about in a sentencing memo when they're asking the judge to look at what Manafort is likely to get. I mean, he's in a unique posture. I mean, for a man his age, who's obviously not done well in prison, even when you look at him now when he comes to court appearances. Right.
Yeah.
Whether he gets 10 years or whether he got 25 years, I mean, to him, that gets mighty close to a life sentence either way.
Yeah.
And so I think the government knows that, and they're operating within the confines of the federal sentencing guidelines, which are advisory to the court. The court will look at things like the amount of money. Have you done other crimes? Did you have a record? Have you accepted responsibility? Did you attempt to block or obstruct the investigation as it went forward, or did you cooperate? All those things get put in for the judge to look at. So I think maybe the government's saying there's a lot of money at stake here. We can track that. He's continued to be uncooperative. We know that from the memos that have come out, and the idea is that he's continued to lie to investigators and not cooperated. And then we've got sort of Manafort in the middle of this web of deceit that goes out and is starting to pick up people very close to Trump.
Their recommendation is 19 and a half to 24 and a half years. Do you think he'll end up in there, and where do you expect?
I think that's the range. I mean, you never know with the federal judge. I mean, there's a great deal of discretion that goes with the court. And but my guess, and a lot of times you see judges hit somewhere in the middle. The problem for Manafort is that he has these other things that have sort of been out there around him where he's continued to do wrong. Yeah. He hadn't come in and just owned up to what happened and cooperated completely. And at the end of the day, that's going to hurt him. I think he's playing for a pardon by doing that. I will tell you that. I think his hope all along is that he can convince the president he's still on his side, that he is going to cover for him, that he'll continue to lie, maybe with the idea that he can blow some smoke and put a smoke screen up so Mueller doesn't see everything. I don't think it's going to do him any good, but I think he's playing to that audience of one and more interested in that than he is interested in the audience of the judge.
All right, talking about audience of one and playing to the president, let's talk about Roger Stone.
Sure.
This latest filing from the special prosecutor's office. And let's pair this with the filing that we saw last month when Stone was indicted, suggesting then that there was a senior member of the campaign who was instructed to check with Stone about the next email dump from WikiLeaks.
Right.
This latest filing, Mueller says it now has evidence, the team has evidence of Stone's communications with Guccifer 2.0, essentially the Russian government, and with WikiLeaks. And I want to revisit with you, as I did with one of the president's supporters a few moments ago, the special counsel's mandate was to investigate any links and or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump. Is that not it right there?
I think it's classically within the discretion, within the mandate of the special counsel here. A lot of people want to argue that, well, we don't have an email from Donald Trump or a phone call from Trump going to Vladimir Putin, so there's no collusion. That's not how these things work. We've talked a little bit about the hub and spoke conspiracy and how you got somebody or some group in the middle of that, and then you've got all these tentacles that go out from that, or the spokes of the wheel, and then this connection of criminal activity or wrongdoing, collusion, conspiracy that join these people. So you may not have this spoke speaking directly to the spoke on the bottom, but they're connected by this idea of doing something wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're seeing. So every time you have, whether it be Mike Flynn, whether it be Roger Stone, whether you have these actors who may be acting on behalf or at the request of Trump or somebody close to him, when they're doing something wrong, that's part of that conspiracy, and it's to complete that common purpose of either having an impact on the election or having some other collusion or conspiracy with the foreign government. And that's a problem for the president as we get closer. This email is going to be particularly interesting, but remember that Mueller has other things.
Yeah.
We're just learning in filings these little bits and pieces. But even when we think about what he did with Manafort, when you go in and say, look, we can prove somebody lied, that meant that he had the truth already. And we're starting to see that we know Mueller's got other pieces to the puzzle that have not been made public. The judge also sort of indicated that when she talked about Kalimnik and things, and whether or not that was a key player and a key part of the investigation. We're not seeing everything, but as we start to see these bits and pieces now coming out as we get closer into the investigation wrapping up, I think, we know that there's a lot behind the scenes that are going to tell the full picture once we see it all.
Bits and pieces. We get a little bit and another piece every time there's another filing.
That's it.
Michael Moore, thanks so much.
Glad to be with you.
All right, Kaylee.
Well, Victor, as the field of Democrats making a 2020 run expands, the buzz is surrounding someone who hasn't decided to run, former Vice President Joe Biden. He'll be speaking at a high-profile security conference in Germany next hour. We've got the details ahead. And welcome back to New Day. I'm Kaylee Hartung in for Christy Paul.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good to be with you. Next hour, former Vice President Joe Biden. He will be speaking at the Munich Security Conference. He's expected to talk about America's role in the world.
And Biden, he's been toying with the idea of running for president in 2020. If he decides to run, it looks like he'd have the support of Democratic voters. Look at this CNN poll. It shows 62% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters say Biden should run, and half of Americans say they would likely support him.
CNN political reporter Arlette Saenz is live from Munich. There, Arlette, tell us more about what we're expecting from the former vice president.
Well, Victor and Kaylee, no clues on whether Vice President Joe Biden will offer any hints about 2020 here in Munich, but he's really going to be focusing on sharing what his worldview is and the role that he thinks the United States should be playing on the international stage. He's also going to be participating in a panel on election integrity. But this all comes as he's still considering whether or not he's going to run for president in 2020. This weekend, you have a lot of Democratic 2020 hopefuls out in early states like South Carolina and New Hampshire. But for Biden, it's a little bit different. He is a regular attendee of this conference here in Munich, and it also gives him a chance to showcase his foreign policy credentials. He has decades of experience, not only from the Senate, but also his 8 years as vice president. And that is an attribute that him and his team would likely promote should he decide to run for president in 2020. Now, but with that experience also comes a long record where his critics could potentially take aim during a Democratic primary. Now, Biden is not the only potential 2020 Democrat here in Munich today. We also have former governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper. He gave a talk this morning on trade and the transatlantic alliance. And the conference also a short while ago heard from Vice President Mike Pence, who said that America is stronger than ever under President Trump. Vice President Joe Biden is likely to give a contrast to that in his upcoming speech in the next hour. Victor and Kaylee.
Arlette Saenz live in Munich. Thank you so much. Now, let the legal challenges begin. President Trump's national emergency, which he himself admits he didn't need to do, immediately facing legal challenges this morning. Up next, we'll talk to a Democratic Congresswoman, Chrissy Houlihan, about what her party plans to do.
Further for flooring at Lumber Liquidators.
President Trump will face challenges in court, already is actually, and in Congress over his declaration of a national emergency at the border with Mexico. The move partially sidesteps Congress to unblock billions of dollars in funding for construction of a border wall. Joining me now, a freshman Democratic Congresswoman representing Pennsylvania 6th, Chrissy Houlihan. Congresswoman, good to have you this morning.
Good morning.
So let's start here. You have called President Trump's declaration of a national emergency irresponsible. Do you also believe it's illegal?
I believe that this is an unintended use of the national emergency's abilities of the president. I agree with Senator Klobuchar in saying that this is not indeed what it was intended to be used for, and instead it should have been for something like the September 11th attacks or a natural disaster that is unexpected. But just because you are unhappy with the bipartisan and bicameral work that the Congress just went through, and you're unhappy with the results of that compromise, does not mean that we are in a national emergency.
Yeah, the expectation is that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi will lead this effort for the House to reject the national emergency, which would force the Senate to take that up within 18 days. This is not, I guess, opposition to the national emergency is not strictly along party lines. I want you to listen, and everyone at home to listen to a couple of Republican senators and their opposition to the declaration of a national emergency.
I continue to believe that this is not what the National Emergencies Act was intended to be used for. It was contemplated as a means for responding to a catastrophic event like an attack on our country or a major natural disaster.
What about if somebody else thinks that climate change is the national emergency, and then what will they do and how far will they go?
Senator Rubio has spoken against the declaration of an emergency. Senator Johnson of Wisconsin. What's your degree of confidence that when the vote comes up in the Senate, that any of these Republican senators will speak with their vote in rejecting the declaration?
Well, I certainly hope that they do speak with their vote. As indicated by their statements, it would seem as though they should speak with their vote. I think that we're in a slippery slope situation, as many of them indicated. I worry that if we reappropriate money that has already been appropriated for national security interests to other areas, that we're putting our troops in harm's way potentially. And the unintended consequences of this declaration of a natural emergency or subsequent declarations of natural emergencies around things like climate change, I think are very, very worrisome and we don't want to set this precedent. So I'm hoping that on both sides of the aisle, we call this out and we say that this is an inappropriate use of this declaration.
You're a veteran, Air Force, if I have that right.
Yes.
And let me ask you about the concerns of military readiness, because the Military Times is reporting that the funds that could be used and what that would be taken from through this national emergency declaration could delay developments or construction of a new vehicle maintenance shop in Kuwait, dry dock repairs at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickman in Hawaii, F-35 hangar improvements at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, ongoing hospital construction at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, that's in Germany obviously, new family housing builds in South Korea, in Italy, and Wisconsin. What's your degree of concern for what this now delays for the U.S. military?
So in addition to being a military and in fact a third generation veteran family, I am also on the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I sit on the Readiness Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. And we did have hearings about this recently, and my concern is the exact concern that you've just read out. We went through a process as a Congress to appropriate and allocate resources to national security interests, and those resources that were appropriated ought to be committed to those particularly line-itemed ideas that we had identified as being needing of funding. We should wait for the president's proposed budget, which should come in another 3 weeks from now. That should be a statement of his values, and it should go through the congressional process of allocating funds. That's the way the process is supposed to work.
Are you expecting or hoping for any consultation if the president decides to use some of those funds to come to Congress and ask for priorities?
Well, in effect, that's what just happened. We just had a 3-week process with two sides sitting down at the table and coming together with a very, very complicated deal, a very, very complicated compromise that allocated resources, as the Congress is intended to do, to different line items, different ideas that had to do in some cases with the border security, and in other cases with other kinds of security, in other cases with the Environmental Protection Agency. And that, in fact, all is what happened. We were asked to weigh in on it. We did. We voted on it. We put it forward to the president. He approved it, and then he decided that he didn't like the final answer.
Let's talk about Syria. The commander of the Syrian Defense Forces has come out just in the last few hours and said that the ISIS-controlled area, the caliphate, as it were, is now been reduced to 75,000 square feet. But there's still ISIS fighters there. He expects to announce victory over the caliphate in the next few days. What should happen next? The president wants to pull out. General Votel told Barbara Starr this week that if he were asked in December when the president made that announcement, that he would not have advised to pull U.S. forces out. What do you think should happen next?
So I agree with General Votel. I also, as I mentioned, sit on those committees, and we have had hearings on Syria in particular as well. And there definitely was a degree of anxiety on the part of those witnesses that I listened to, that they felt as though it wasn't the appropriate thing to do at this time to withdraw those troops for a number of reasons, because they felt as though they would be leaving people behind who needed more help and more support, because they felt it would be too quick of a withdrawal and not a thoughtful enough withdrawal, and they felt that it would therefore be putting our troops in harm's way. And so I am anxious about the idea that we should be pulling out of Syria.
All right, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania 6th, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Trapped in Haiti by violent anti-government protests, several nurses from Canada had to launch a GoFundMe page to pay for their own evacuation. We'll talk to one of them to raise money for an evacuation out of Haiti. They're trapped at a Christian charity compound because of violent anti-government protests there.
And we spoke to one of the nurses, and we'll hear from her in just a moment. Meanwhile, those protesters are demanding that the Haitian president resign because of soaring inflation, fuel price hikes, accusations of corruption. Here's CNN's Zain Asher.
Protesters running from tear gas, clashes with police, barricades and fires, stores looted. These are the scenes of anger paralyzing Haiti's largest cities after more than a week of deadly unrest. The demonstrators are demanding their president's resignation.
I'm in this situation because of the Haitian president. I can't go to school. He is a thief. He must go. If not, we'll burn down this whole country.
Accused of corruption, the administration remained silent for days as outrage grew. Then, in a televised address on Thursday, the president issued a defiant response.
We have already had a series of transitional governments that have given a package of disasters and disorders. I will not leave the country in the hands of armed gangs and drug traffickers.
As the security situation worsens, Canada has closed its embassy, and dozens of foreign tourists reportedly found themselves stranded after roads to Haiti's largest airport were blocked. The U.S. has ordered all non-emergency personnel and their families to leave, and advising U.S. citizens not to travel to Haiti due to crime and civil unrest, citing widespread violent and unpredictable demonstrations. Meanwhile, humanitarian aid agencies are evacuating some staff who have been working to provide relief for the impoverished nation.
Well, the work has basically ground to a halt. Public transport has been more or less non-existent, and it's unsafe to go out in cars because you don't know where roadblocks will be and or demonstrations.
Haiti remains one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And after a devastating earthquake in 2010 that killed more than 200,000 people, despite international efforts to help, the state of the economy remains in a state of disarray.
The price of the dollar is going up and up and up. We can't stay in this situation. There will surely be a revolution in the country.
Besides skyrocketing inflation, reports of a long-running corruption scandal are also fueling unrest. Billions of dollars earmarked for social development in Haiti allegedly went missing, sparking anger among citizens with little left to lose. Zain Asher, CNN.
As we said, 8 Canadian nurses, they started a GoFundMe page so they can get out of Haiti.
They needed $9,000 and they've already raised more than $16,000. We spoke to one of those nurses, Tracy Hata, moments ago. She described the scene outside the compound they're trapped in.
The pastor that is the director of the compound has instructed us not to go outside into the community across the highway, which is where the roadblocks are. So we're here. We can get people to come in, and we can still provide health care for them and feeding programs. Schools have been shut. We do have a school on the compound. So we are safe here, but they will not let us to go outside the compound.
What kind of help do people need amidst these violent anti-government protests?
I think I'm not a political person, but I think that they would want the president to step down so that they're very destitute down here, and the ones that we're actually treating, they live in huts, they sleep on the floor, they have no running water, they have no bathrooms, they have zero health care. So they're very, very destitute here, and I think they're just taking desperate measures to try to make a change for themselves.
You and the other nurses launching this GoFundMe page in hopes of raising money for your own evacuation. Do you have any concept of when it could be that you're able to get out?
We have secured a helicopter as of about 9 o'clock last night. We secured a helicopter, which is a Haitian helicopter, to take out on Monday.
Tracy tells us the helicopter will land at the compound and fly them directly to the Port-au-Prince airport. That way, they don't have to try to make their way through any of the violence or chaos on the streets.
Breaking news this morning, a man who was once the most senior figure in the Catholic Church is no longer a priest, at least one of the most senior figures. The Vatican has dismissed disgraced former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick after a church trial found him guilty of sexually abusing minors for decades. McCarrick, who once led the Archdiocese of Washington, will not be able to appeal this decision. CNN's Delia Gallagher has more on his downfall.
He is the one who has saved us.
He was once a prince of the church and a friend of presidents. Former Washington, D.C. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick enjoyed a spectacular career at the heart of power in Washington and in Rome. When the U.S. Cardinals were summoned to the Vatican by John Paul II in 2002 at the beginning of the sex abuse scandal, Cardinal McCarrick was the reassuring face of that crisis, advocating zero tolerance for abusers, even as there were unrevealed allegations against him.
I can't see how anyone in the United States today would cover up something like that.
Theodore McCarrick was created a cardinal in 2001 by John Paul II. Around that time, an American priest wrote to the Vatican to warn them of rumors that the cardinal was sexually abusing seminarians. But no action was taken for years, until, according to the Vatican under Benedict XVI, McCarrick was quietly advised not to travel or to be seen in public and live a discreet life of prayer and penance to avoid further rumors of his sexual misconduct with seminarians. A recommendation which the cardinal seemed to ignore, as he continued traveling and appearing in public, even at the 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis. But then, in June last year, accusations that McCarrick had abused a minor were found credible by an internal church investigation in New York. Although McCarrick maintained his innocence, he resigned as cardinal, something that has rarely happened in the history of the Catholic Church. Finally, he was brought to trial at the Vatican, though by now 88 years old and infirm, he did not attend in person. Delia Gallagher, CNN, Rome.
And still to come, Payless is closing all of its remaining stores in the U.S. It's the latest retailer to join a growing list of dying brick and mortar